Kia ora, and welcome to another episode in a series of short videos on the essence of regulation. In this episode we will talk about regulatory failure and regulatory success. Now it goes without saying that every regulator wants to be successful. Unfortunately, and as we have seen in a previous episode on regulatory impact assessment, it is incredibly difficult for regulators to take ownership of the successful outcomes of their regulatory interventions. Take again that example of safety belts. If we witness a reduction of crash-related injuries in people who were wearing safety belts, can we say this is the successful result of a regulator mandating people to wear safety belts? Or is it the result of the police who is checking if people wear safety belts and fining them if they do not? Or is it perhaps the result of stressing the relevance of wearing safety belts in advertisements such as these? Now, most people would argue that regulators cannot make such direct causal claims. After all, regulators are not the only ones who are influencing the use of safety belts. For example, car producers stress the use of safety belts in their advertisements. The media does also, generally by reporting the horror stories of the consequences of not wearing them. Some insurance companies provide incentives to their clients to wear safety belts. And even movies and other forms of popular media arguably influence people to wear safety belts as well. So if people's behavior is influenced by so many different organizations, incentives and forces, how can regulators then claim that their regulation has achieved the success they were after? Strikingly, the story seems to be completely different in a situation where regulation is experienced to fail in achieving its desired outcomes. The media, policymakers and citizens at large very easily point to regulators and their regulation as the source of failure when things go wrong. See, for example, this news feed from Google. Or perhaps more strikingly, in preparing this episode, I had a quick look at how often some of the world's most read newspapers report on regulatory success and regulatory failure. And guess what? On average, they are 10 times more likely to tell stories of regulatory failure than of regulatory success. So what's going on here? Is regulation failing 10 times more often than it succeeds? Or are regulators and their regulation assessed against different standards when people look at the success and lack thereof of regulatory governance and practice? Now, I think it is fair to say that the latter is more likely the case than the former. And I am not alone in thinking this. But I also think that more is at stake here. Regulatory success can be observed in the tens or even hundreds of normal experiences that we have each and every day. The food in your fridge that most of the time doesn't go stale before the expiry date. Your fellow road users that most of the time stick to stopping for red traffic lights when yours are green. The house that you live in that most of the time doesn't collapse. And so on and so forth. In other words, we often do not observe the positive contribution of regulation to the predictability and certainty of our daily lives. We only observe regulation when things go wrong, when regulation hampers what we want to do. So we mainly observe the functioning of regulation when the predictability and the certainty of our daily lives is disturbed or otherwise negatively affected. And when things go wrong, we humans tend to search for sources outside of us that we can hold accountable. And regulators are in a very difficult position here. The flip side of not being able to claim the successes of their hard work because of all the complexities that are at play is that they can also not explain how much or how little a failure is the result of their regulatory intervention and implementation. But again, I think that more is at stake here. The term regulatory failure is used to point to a very broad category of larger and smaller mishaps in the regulatory process. For example, when a policymaker is captured by an interest group to stall the development of new regulation, it is called regulatory failure. But also when a target of regulation has been allowed to self-regulate but doesn't do this well, it is termed regulatory failure. Likewise, when regulatory intermediaries violate the authority delegated to them, it is termed regulatory failure. Even when court cases are not settled quickly enough after a party has been found in violation of regulation by a regulator, it is termed regulatory failure. So the term regulatory failure is an umbrella term for a wide variety of people's experiences. But as an umbrella term, it is of little help to understand what exactly went wrong within the regulatory process or elsewhere, and whether and how improved regulation would help to improve the predictability and reliability of that specific situation. So regulators may wish to do a few things to change the narratives around regulatory failure. First is to be much more attentive to capturing evidence of regulatory success. For example, capturing the day-to-day positive experiences of regulators and their targets, and that may eventually help to craft a narrative of ongoing success. Now, unfortunately, that narrative will sometimes be punctured by a regulatory failure. And if that happens, it will be relevant for regulators to take ownership of this failure where such ownership is due. At the same time, the regulator can take ownership of the emerging regulatory failure narrative and begin breaking it down to find out and explain what part of the regulatory process has fallen short exactly and how the regulator will work to improve it. Now, with that, I have come to the end of this episode. Naam Mihi, and I hope to see you again soon.